It's crazy that I grew up in Florida and never learned this history while I lived here. This "we shall overcome," begging to be with those that disgrace you, never sat right with me. What sat right with me was Malcolm X. He was talking about revolution.
We declare our right on this earth by any means necessary.
A revolution that doesn't involve bloodshed, then you're afraid to bleed. Land is the basis of all independence. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and
Fighting back and asserting one's manhood. That spoke to me. But was all this even possible? Then, after I left Florida, I learned about Florida. Millions of people travel to Florida yearly to escape the reality of their busy lives to enjoy Disney World, sunny beaches, and other tourist attractions. Among these notable tourist attractions is the old city of St. Augustine, a city established by the Spanish in the year 1565, before the nation we know as the United States was ever even thought of. However, the millions of tourists that pass through San Marcos Castle, as well as other state landmarks, are told a history about Florida that overlooks an important chapter in history of independence, freedom, and emancipation. No, this chapter of history we are talking about is not America's War of Independence. It is not the Civil War. This is a story of America's successful slave rebellion, Florida's Maroon Wars. This hidden history of African resistance to enslavement, which seems to have been kept from the people by design, begins with the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade to the British colonies in the early 1600s. In 1627, the island of Barbados was formally colonized by the British. After years of trying Irish labor as indentured servants on the sugar plantations, British colonialists began to switch to African labor. This massive influx of the importation of African slave labor resulted in a rebellious slave population, and, due to overcultivation and a lack of crop rotation, it led to a soil depleted of its nutrients. The combination of these factors drove Barbados planters to reconsider their enterprise in the small Caribbean island and migrate to the North American colony known as Carolina, founded in the year 1670. In Carolina, the planters made rice their primary cash crop of choice. Accordingly, they began to demand African slave labor from the Upper Guinea region of West Africa, where rice was grown as a staple crop. However, in addition to bringing in Africans from the whereabouts of Guinea, Sierra Leone, and the Senegambia region, many South Carolinians imported Africans from West Central Africa within the vicinity of a place called Congo Kingdom. In the Low Country Carolina, due to the nature of the rice production, in the malaria and yellow fever infested wetlands of the Sea Islands, whites stayed away from these areas using black overseers to ensure that the daily tasks were being completed. These Africans, being in isolation from the Euro-American culture enabled them to retain a great degree of their African cultural practices, birthing an American-born culture based in Africa called Gullah Geechee culture. The word Gullah, historians say, either comes from the ethnic group from Sierra Leone known as the Gola, or it is referring to the Angola captives, a generic labeling of the Africans originating from West Central Africa in and around present-day Congo and Angola. The word Geechee, on the other hand, is said to have its origins in the ethnic group from Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea known as the Kishi, though some say that it comes from the Ogeechee River. The enslaved people in the Sea Islands off the coast of Carolina may have had it slightly better than those who were enslaved on the mainland. Nevertheless, the stripping of natural rights, the torture, brutality, and the arduous daily task associated with rice and indigo cultivation drove these Africans to resist. One of the ways that they resisted was by flight. And to where did these Africans mostly take flight? A little place called Florida. Welcome to Seminole County, Florida. Used to come through these paths back in the day when we were younger to go to our friend Sam's house. These could have been locations where you had Maroons hiding out all throughout the 19th century. See, there were a lot of Maroon communities all throughout Florida. We have a tendency to not really hear about really any of them because their existence was predicated on not being detected, right? So many of the Maroon communities in Florida were actually a lot smaller, but there were actually a lot of big ones as well. Like you had ones that were like, 800 community members, 900 community members, 700 community members, some coming upward near 1,000 community members. But you had a lot of smaller bands as well, and that would have probably been located in places like this because their very existence was predicated on not being detected. So here we are in Seminole County, in the place that I actually grew up. And now the interesting thing about this is Seminole County, right? The word Seminole has its origins in the word cimarron. Cimarron was the word that the Spanish used to describe runaway cattle way back in the 1500s. But once they started to bring enslaved Africans to Latin America, they started to use this term to also describe runaway slaves. So when the slaves used to run away and escape up into the mountains, they called them cimarrones. Some people say that the word cimarrón comes from the Spanish word encima, meaning on top. But as time went on, other Europeans started to adopt this term because they started also bringing African captives into their colonies. The word cimarrón became adopted by the French, and the French called it marron, M-A-R-R-O-N. When the British started to bring their Africans into the West Indies and other parts of the Americas, they started to use the word maroon. But in Spanish Florida, where we are today, that word cimarrón, plural cimarrones, had become corrupted through time. And after a while, cimarrones became known as Seminoles, and Seminoles became known as Seminoles. So the word Seminole actually has its origin in the word cimarrón, which means runaway, renegade, slave. Now, if you go all the way back to the beginning of the African diaspora, if you go all the way back to the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, you will find a lot of terms that were being used in different parts of the Americas to describe runaway slaves. So like I said, you have cimarrón, you have the quilombo was used in Brazil, you have palenque used in parts of Spanish America, and the word maroon. But you also find there are different locations throughout the Americas where the terms describing runaway slaves still exist to this day to describe runaway communities that existed in those areas. Like for instance, you have the term yanga in Mexico, describing the runaway cimarrón that actually established his own community in Mexico and fought against the Spanish for several decades, being able to create his own community that still exists to this day in Mexico. You have the community in Colombia called San Basilio de Palenque, which is also in existence to this day in Colombia. You have another community in Cuba known as El Cimarrón. That the namesake of these runaway renegade communities are still in existence throughout the Americas. And then also right here in Central Florida, we have our own Seminole County. And this is the place where I grew up, but for some odd reason, going to school at Castleberry Elementary on the other side of these woods, attending South Seminole Middle School, I attended Seminole Community College, I coach now for Seminole Hoops, but for some reason, this entire time, I had no idea that Seminole derives from the term used to describe runaway slaves. Africans who emancipated themselves from slavery and created their own independent communities throughout Central Florida. And throughout the entire Florida, really. But the interesting thing is this. Here we are in the woods, in a location, Seminole County probably got its namesake for the most part because there were a lot of Seminoles living here. But one of the things that they don't usually teach us is the fact that there were red Seminoles and there were black Seminoles. The black Seminoles played a very large part in this fight for liberation from enslavement. If you look over here, there were a lot of smaller maroon communities that might have existed in a place just like this, trying to be undetected by the Americans that eventually went into Florida, conquering after this land was ceded to the United States from the Spanish. I just think it's criminal that we didn't learn about these things in Seminole County, attending South Seminole Middle School.
It was at St. Augustine, Florida, that the Spanish established a permanent settlement back in 1565. And with their British rivals inching closer to the Spanish territory, with their establishment of Carolina, the Spanish were seeking all the assistance they can get in the defense of their North American territory. And we will now take our trip to that side of Florida to see what the state has to say about these self-emancipators.
Right now, we are in St. Augustine.
After marching through miles of wilderness, the Castillo is within sight, seemingly close. And can it be taken? A treacherous obstacle course of rising slopes, low walls, and a moat, all protected by Spanish soldiers and cannons, await anyone foolish enough to attack. The massive high walls of the fort provide its defenders with a perfect view of enemy movements. The cannons within the star-shaped fort are positioned to catch attackers in a deadly crossfire. In 1702 and 1740, attackers tried long sieges rather than attempt a direct assault on this fortress. Oh, so I have it in Spanish as well. What if we could just walk right through the field? You see the history here is very dismissive of the rich African history, which is very typical of here in Florida. This is information that you got to dig up, man. You got to dig deep. You got to go to the archives. You got to read the primary sources. You got to look up the historians that are discussing this kind of thing. Because if you don't, and you just go to these public spaces and read the little plaques that they have on these fortresses, you would think that there was no such thing as African people. But the reality is, they were very heavily involved in all these conflicts going on in this place. In spite of the fact that there is a noticeable absence of this black history here at St. Augustine, the influence was very real. After Carolina was established in the 1670s, the West Central Africans and the Upper Guinea Africans that were being imported into the British colony in such large numbers started to escape south towards Florida. By 1683, St. Augustine established its first black and mulatto militia. The British establishment of Charlestown in 1670 represented a serious challenge to Spanish supremacy in the region. This compelled the Spanish to make use of the self-emancipating Africans to strengthen their posts. In the 1680s, Governor Diego de Quiroga reported several Africans who escaped from Carolina and requested baptism into the true faith on the basis that the governor did not return them to the British. These Africans were instructed under the Catholic faith, a religion that was not very foreign to many of the Bakongo self-emancipators because of the trade relations that the Congo Kingdom had with Portugal since 1482. In addition, according to historian Jane Landers, they worked as ironsmiths and laborers on the Fort Castillo de San Marcos. Women were employed in the households. As waves of self-emancipating Africans continued to escape into Spanish Florida, on November 7, 1693, Charles II of Spain issued the first official edict, giving liberty to all, the men as well as the women, so that by their example and by the king's liberality, others will do the same. These Africans who escaped were to exchange military service in defense of Florida for the recognized freedom from the enslavement under Spanish law. By the year 1708, the black population outnumbered whites in the Carolina colony. This increased African population led to the growing resistance. In 1711 and 1714, there were slave revolts in the British colony. 1 year later, the Yamasee Wars were waged between a variety of indigenous Americans and enslaved Africans on one side, and the British colonialists on the other. The indigenous Americans in the region had developed an alliance with the British settlers in Carolina until it became apparent that the European settlers placed more value in enslaving natives than they were in establishing friendships. Natives were sold in a North American slave trade traversing the mainland as well as the Caribbean islands. Once the indigenous Americans were fed up with this, they waged war against the English settlers and had the enslaved Africans of Carolina on their side. According to Jane Landers, the natives and the Africans almost succeeded in exterminating the badly outnumbered whites. What prevented this reality was the fact that there were some natives who were loyal to the British who assisted in driving the rebellious natives and Africans out of the area. This led to yet another surge of Africans and natives into Florida. A tight bond developed between the Yamasee and the Africans as many of them continued to flee into Florida. This culture of running away had become so paramount that the British decided to establish in 1732 the colony of Georgia as a free colony where slavery would not be permitted. This colony would serve as a buffer between the slave society of South Carolina and the freedom that the Africans were seeking in Florida. James Oglethorpe, the founder of the buffer colony, wanted to establish a debtor colony where England's debt-ridden citizens can come and work off their debts, then making a living for themselves without having to worry about the competition from the wealthy, slave-owning planter elite, who too often stifled competition with their control over land, labor, and markets. Despite the presence of Georgia, Africans continued to escape south into Florida, offering their alliances to the Spanish government to the point that a separate black town of approximately 100 was established 2 miles north of St. Augustine, known as Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, for short, known as Fort Mose. And this is where we will take our next journey. Welcome to Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, also known as Fort Mose. This is the location where the Africans had escaped from South Carolina in the late 1600s, early 1700s, to the point where they finally eventually formed their own little community just outside of St. Augustine. This new community here was a community that the purpose of it was really to defend St. Augustine from the encroaching British. All right, so the blacks that escaped down into this area here, if they served in the military, their freedom would be recognized and acknowledged by the Spanish.
But that's not to say that only all the Africans that came down here were in the Spanish military, but the ones that chose to sign up for the Spanish military in exchange for their protection, in exchange for their recognition of their freedom, came to this location here. A lot of other ones went and created their own independent maroon communities throughout Florida. Others went and mixed in with the Native Americans throughout Florida. But this is one of the options that the Africans actually had, was to form this community here known as Fort Mose.
Though Spanish Florida was a much better option than British Carolina, when the Africans first escaped into the southern peninsula, their treatment wasn't always pleasant. In the 1720s, Governor Antonio de Benavides attempted to put the self-liberated Africans in an indentured status under the state, in some cases resulting in their sale back into slavery. One African veteran of the Yamasee Wars, Francisco Menendez, was appointed by the governor to command a black militia in 1726. Menendez and his African men fought valiantly in defending Florida from the British invasion in 1728. It wasn't until 1737 that their petitions for true freedom, and not indentureship, would be realized under the new governor, Manuel de Montiano. On March 15, 1738, unconditional freedom was granted to the black freedom fighters in and around St. Augustine. This is what led to the creation of Fort Mose. The freedmen built the settlement, which contained a walled fort and shelters that the Spanish described as resembling Indian huts. British observers described the walled fort as being constructed with stone, 4 square with a flanker at each corner, banked with earth, having a ditch without on all sides, lined around with prickly royal, and had a well and a house within, and a lookout. This fort has since been destroyed, and the only thing left are the memories. The Africans also planted crops on the fertile lands around the fort. There was an abundance of salt water surrounding the area where they sustained themselves on an abundance of fish of all kinds. The Africans at Fort Mose engaged in trade with the Spanish at St. Augustine. It is estimated that around 70% of Africans imported into South Carolina during the late 1730s arrived from the Congo-Angola region. Many of them were escaping towards St. Augustine. The Spanish kept records of the nation of origin of the Africans, and though not always accurate, it gives an idea of the predominance of Bakongo culture in the region.
Good. A very interesting thing here about this is what you see here is African symbols. This symbolizes the Congo cosmogram. A lot of the Africans that actually escaped down into Florida were from South Carolina, and many of those imported into South Carolina actually came from the Congo. And this is the Congo cosmogram, which represents the circle of life. This represents birth, maturity, death, and the afterlife. This part right here is also known as noon or ntoto. This represents midnight, mpemba. This represents masculinity, femininity, and this represents the circle of life. All right, reincarnation. Congo cosmogram, counterclockwise motion.
Vestiges of the Congo cosmogram can be found throughout the African diaspora today in symbols like the Haitian Vev, in Palamonte in Cuba, and in the counterclockwise spiritual dance known as the ring shout. There is also evidence of the Congo cosmogram symbolism along the Underground Railroad. Between 1735 and 1763, there were 147 black marriages reported. 52 of them were designated as Congos, while the next largest group were the Caravilis, who were most likely to be Igbo, and the third largest group was the Mandingos, or Mandinka. According to records, the people of Fort Mose were remarkably adaptable. They spoke several American indigenous, European, and African languages. They brought with them their own African culture, but were very open to adopting Spanish and Native American culture. After a year of this formally established fort, the word spread about this African sanctuary in Spanish Florida, which compelled Africans in Carolina at the time to engage in the largest slave rebellion in British North America up to that date, known as the Stono Rebellion. So we are here in Fort Mose. Fort Mose became so popular that in 1739, in South Carolina, you had what was known as the Stono Rebellion. And the Stono Rebellion was a rebellion in which, in South Carolina, near Stono River, where you had Africans of Bakongo ancestry, or who were actually Bakongo themselves, imported straight from Central Africa, who decided to rise up against their masters, break into a gun store, and liberate themselves from slavery. And the goal was to reach down into Spanish Florida. John Thornton, historian, he actually writes about the fact that a lot of these people that were from the Congo were actually Catholic, or if not Catholic, had some Catholic understanding, and some of them actually spoke Portuguese. So we all know that Spanish and Portuguese are mutually intelligible languages, so they looked at this as an inspiration as well to go down into Spanish Florida, because they can also understand the reading, the language, and also understand the Catholic religion being practiced in Spanish Florida. So yeah, this is where some of the freedom fighters of African descent decided to reside, many of whom were of Congolese descent, or what I call Bakongo descent. And that's why you see the Congo cosmogram and those kinds of things over here. But this is the location that you see around here where they would have resided during this time, and this is where they engaged in all kinds of activities. Some of them were blacksmiths, some of them were purely soldiers, some of them were cattle ranchers, some of them were farmers of other types, but they made themselves a living here. And this is one of the many options in which runaways decided to practice their freedom. Like I explained before, many of them actually escaped into other parts of Florida as independent Maroons, while you had some that actually escaped and lived alongside the Native Americans. Fort Mose. This historic site, established in 1994, actually provides a great deal of African history as well as the history of African resistance to enslavement here in Florida. The curious part about it is that it is segregated from the history of St. Augustine at the San Marcos Castle attraction, just 2 miles away.
I learned about the Catholic faith. The other men and I went to work as ironmiths and helped build the fort, Castillo de San Marcos. Our wives worked in the governor's home here in St. Augustine. We weren't free yet, but in St. Augustine, we got paid for our work, and I got to live with my wife and child.
Yes, Mama, please. My name is Isabel de las Rios. I am a fully African woman. I sell fashion Spanish and shoes on my domestic honesty. Living in Spanish Florida, I encounter many different lifestyles. I feel like a
Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum.
My name is Anna, and I'm an American Indian. I escaped from Carolina with my husband, Francisco Garcia. We became slaves in St. Augustine for a prominent Spanish family. The Spanish system of slavery is different from the English system. In St. Augustine, we were paid for our labor and allowed to live together. We were baptized and married in the Catholic Church. When our daughter Francisca Maria was born, she was baptized too. After becoming free, we came here to Fort Mosaic.
The video you are about to watch shows actual footage from the excavations at Fort Mosaic that took place from 1986 to 1988. Before archaeologists could begin studying the site, they had to find it. Listen as project archaeologist Dr. Kathleen Deegan explains how they discovered the site's location.
We had maps of the fort from the 18th century that were quite detailed, and they showed the streams and the fields and the fort itself in a way we could relate to the present landscape. And we compared those maps to aerial photographs of the area today, and were able to pinpoint where mows should be according to the 18th century maps. Actually, we scaled the 18th century maps to the same scale as the modern aerial photos, and then we printed them on clear plastic and did an overlay, and we could see just where the fort should be. And it was, in fact, on the island we've been looking at all along. When we compare the maps and streams to the present waterways, we could pinpoint pretty well where that should have been. Then the idea was to excavate in the spot we believed it was, and if it was the fort, there should be artifacts dating to the fort's time period, and there should be moat and evidence for the earthwork, and all those things we did find where we expected them.
An excavation team from the Florida Museum of Natural History, headed by archaeologist Dr. Kathleen Deegan and graduate student John Marin, began to investigate the site. This is the bottom of the moat as it appears in the ground. The moat was filled in after the fort was abandoned, and today appears as a dark stain in the soil. The dirt and shells above the moat were deposited on the ground after Fort Mosaic was abandoned. Most of the dirt in the site is...
Africans continued to run away to support the black contingency and independent black communities of Florida. However, this would all come to an end after the 7 Years' War, when the British defeated the French and their Spanish allies, resulting in the cession of Spanish Florida to the British in 1763. The Spanish and their African allies living in and around Fort Mosaic evacuated the region, moving to Matanzas, Cuba. However, though many blacks left with the Spanish in 1763, there were smaller maroon communities, some independent, and others that allied with the natives that remained in Florida. From 1763 to 1783, Florida was officially British territory. It was divided into East and West Florida at the Apalachicola River and the Panhandle. In the final 8 years of their occupation of the peninsular territory, the British monarchy was at war with 13 of her colonies. Starting with Massachusetts, American colonists started protesting what they considered to be unfair policies coming from the Crown. Once the protests turned into war, the British thought it to be wise, like their Spanish and French counterparts, to utilize a black militia to assist them in their battle against their cousins on the other side of the pond. Colonial Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation by the end of the year in 1775 pronouncing all runaway slaves that make it to British lines and fight for the crown shall be freed in exchange for their services. Lord Dunmore's proclamation is what turned Britain's southern colonies against the crown. Florida, being Britain's most southern territory on continental North America at the time, did not secede with the northern neighbors. Renowned historian Gerald Horne posits that, quote, the legacy of Spanish Florida had not dissipated. This is, the presence of a corps of armed Africans, and what had become an industry of annoying Georgia by providing refuge to escaping Africans. Still, there was worriment about arming Africans to confront rebels, though this was hardly avoidable. Moreover, Seminoles and Creeks had pledged to back the crown. As things turned out, scores of armed Africans prevented the defection of Florida. Close quote. After the colonies declared independence from Britain in the summer of 1776, scores of Africans flooded into St. Augustine from South Carolina and Georgia. While the Continental Army did not allow blacks in their military until 1778, the British Redcoats were very receptive of the Africans who saw the incentive to take up arms against their former masters. By the end of the war, 20,000 blacks fought on the side of the British compared to the 5,000 blacks that fought on the side of the American colonists. In 1781, after the Battle of Yorktown, the British fled to Florida, the Bahamas, and other Caribbean islands with thousands of enslaved and formerly enslaved peoples. Many of the now free black allies of the British who assisted them in the war against the American colonists made Florida their home. During the British era, blacks would constitute a majority of the population in Florida. After the Treaty of Paris, officially ending the war between the 13 American colonies on one side and the British on the other, Florida was retroceded to the Spanish. However, there were many British loyalist farmers who had established farms in the area under the more flexible Spanish laws. Some would defend later when the U.S. tried to invade during the Patriot War in 1812. Nevertheless, the second Spanish colonial government, just south of the slave-holding newly independent United States, offered religious sanctuary for those fleeing persecution. This offering, obviously, would include the African runaways. For the first 6 years, Africans continued to escape into the re-established Spanish territory. Under U.S. President George Washington's administration, the Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson pressured Spain to abandon their policy of legally accepting the self-liberating Africans into their territory. This foreign policy arranged by Thomas Jefferson is the first example of the United States government working tirelessly to strip the land of Florida for the freedom that it provided for the many thousands that lived there. Jefferson, as an affluent slave owner who profited tremendously off the institution, has a conflicting record on his public stance on slavery. In his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, he acknowledged the wrongs of slavery until other Southern delegates encouraged him to take the passage out. On the other hand, he also fought for slavery to expand into the Northwest Territory, north of the Ohio River, upon the establishment of the country. He reversed President John Adams' policy of supporting the African rebels of the Haitian Revolution and feared that they would inspire Africans to rise up and overthrow their captors in the South, but at the same time empathized with Black Revolution when he proposed relocation instead of execution for the Gabriel Prosser conspirators of the year 1800. Jefferson proposed that Prosser and other black rebels in the United States be sent to Saint-Domingue. He stated that the, quote, West Indies offer a more probable and practicable retreat for them. The most promising portion of them is the island of San Domingo, where the blacks are established into a sovereignty de facto and have organized themselves under regular laws and government. Close quote. Nevertheless, at the end of the day, it was apparent that Jefferson and other founding fathers lived in fear of black revolution. Jefferson stated in reference to a potential black uprising in the United States in 1782, quote, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation, is among possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural interference. Close quote. Black revolution was fomenting throughout the West Indies during this time, and Florida, geographically, was inextricably linked to the Caribbean world. As revolutionary Africans continued to escape into Florida, forming black militias as well as sustainable communities, enticing enslaved Africans from southern plantations to seek refuge in their communities, the U.S. government began to put their focus on the acquisition of the territory. In addition to this avaricious thirst for acquiring neighboring territories, this quest for the acquisition of land was also fueled by the fear of the Spanish and British landholdings in close proximity to the United States, in which the European nations may use the opportunity-seeking Africans in their quest for a land grab from a newborn country. After America's war for independence, Spanish territory virtually surrounded the United States, with Louisiana on the west side, New Spain in the southwest, and the Floridas on the south side. In the 1790s, with turmoil reaching Europe due to the French Revolution and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars, as well as the many wars between nations that sprang from it, backroom deals and new alliances formed. Indubitably, a young United States will be caught in the middle of all of this. According to James Cusick, in 1800, the Spanish crown, in an effort to appease Napoleon, secretly ceded its province of Louisiana back to France. However, after it became clear that the Africans in Saint-Domingue were going to overthrow the lucrative sugar colony indefinitely and establish themselves a free nation, Napoleon, being pressed for cash for his wars of expansion in Europe after the loss of Saint-Domingue, decided to sell the Louisiana territory to Thomas Jefferson for $15 million, or about 4 cents an acre, in 1803. There were disputes between the United States and Spain about the boundaries between where Louisiana began and West Florida ended. But ultimately, the goal of Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe was to eventually take Florida, especially when it was realized that the British and the Spanish, two historic enemies who had territory surrounding the United States, were now allies in 1808 during Napoleon's wars. While all of this conflict was going on throughout the Atlantic world, the Africans, who were caught in the middle of all this, continued to fight for their freedom and win by strategically allying themselves with their enemy's enemy. By the early 1800s, the most definitive enemy of the black man in North America was the United States government and their quest for expansion. After the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, cotton production expanded, and so too did slavery. States like Georgia, and especially South Carolina, increased their imports of Africans straight from the continent exponentially in the 1790s and early 1800s. The years 1806 and 1807 were by far the largest number of Africans ever imported in individual years into South Carolina straight from the continent, amounting to over 32,000 between those 2 years. In addition, Cuba increased their slave trade from Africa right around the same period. Many slave owners in the South took advantage of these markets, especially after the transatlantic slave trade was abolished in the United States in 1808. Lastly, the domestic slave trade was also on the rise, with African Americans being sold from Virginia into the newly developing territories of the Deep South just outside of the Floridas, with the newly arriving enslaved Africans continuing to escape down into East Florida, adding to the revolutionary appeal and the threat of the German Coast slave revolt just outside of West Florida. In present-day Louisiana, planters across southern Georgia began to petition Congress to invade Spanish Florida in what was called the Patriot War. So between the years of 1812 and roughly 1815, we have what is called the Patriot War. And the Patriot War sometimes is referred to as the Other War of 1812. Now, why is it the Other War of 1812? Well, it's because it was a secret war. It was a secret war in which James Madison, who was the president, James Monroe, who was the Secretary of State, and a bunch of Southern planters and the governor of Georgia by the name of David Mitchell decided we're going to have a secret invasion of a sovereign nation known as Spain, Spanish Florida. The origins of the Patriot War came about when 5 wealthy planters living in the northern part of East Florida, around present-day Jacksonville, decided that East Florida would be in better shape considering the tumultuous Napoleonic Wars if it were in the hands of the United States and not a weakening Spain. In 1810, John McIntosh, George Fleming, Don Fernando de la Masa Arredondo, Andrew Atkinson, and Lieutenant Justo Lopez, concerned that Spain was going to fall to Napoleon, met with the former governor of Georgia, General George Matthews, convincing him of a plot to overturn Spanish rule in East Florida and requesting the assistance of the United States. Since this was something that officials had wanted in the United States for some time, it did not take much convincing for the former governor of Georgia to take this idea and run with it. According to historian James Cusick, quote, "The conspirators lost their nerve and abandoned their plot. The panic about Spain's survival passed, the mood of the moment vanished, and they quickly changed their minds, deciding that the American intervention in East Florida would be both unwelcome and undesirable." Close quote. Though these original 5 conspirators lost their nerve to go on with the rebellion against Spain, Matthews proposed the idea to President James Madison, and the president supported it. Within time, President James Madison, Secretary of State James Monroe, and former President Thomas Jefferson sponsored the secret and illegal invasion of Florida by Georgia patriots. What they ended up doing was they sent in all kinds of troops into North Florida and invading farther and farther south down into what is St. Augustine. But see, the Americans underestimated the allies of the Spanish, because the Spanish were actually very preoccupied at the time fighting the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. But in 1813, 1814, who decides to step up to the plate? Well, the people that were actually fighting to defend and protect their freedom more than the Spanish. And that was the runaway slaves and the Native Americans. It was actually the runaway slaves and the Native Americans here around Fort Mose that decided to fight tooth and nail for their independence and freedom. And they ended up repelling this invasion, this secret invasion, this illegal invasion by the United States into Florida. And they ended up sending these U.S. troops, many of whom starved, died, dozens killed by runaway slaves, and repelling these people back out of the state of Florida. Shortly after this point, you would have the Foultown massacres, you would have the Battle of Negro Fort. But it was the Africans who fought and defended and protected their freedom here at Fort Mose more than anybody else. And this is the location in which they decided to not give up. They decided to continue to fight. And this is the location in which they continue to thrive. Governor of Georgia at the time, David Mitchell, on July 17, 1812, wrote with surprise to President James Madison and Secretary of State James Monroe that, quote, "They have armed every able-bodied Negro within their power," close quote. At the time of this war, there were about 2,000 enslaved Africans in East Florida near the St. Johns River. The Maroons assisted in the liberation of scores of Africans from various plantations. In addition to the local Maroons fighting, a black militia was also sent in from Cuba to assist in the defense of free Florida. The Georgia governor also wrote in fear of this black militia that, quote, "If they are suffered to remain in the province, our southern country will soon be in the state of insurrection," close quote. Governor Mitchell sent a series of letters to Secretary of State Monroe showing grave concern for the African presence in their fight against the illegal invasion into Florida. In September of 1812, the Georgia governor complained to President Madison and Secretary of State Monroe that the Spanish governor of St. Augustine had, quote, "proclaimed freedom to every Negro who will join his standard, and has sent a party of them to unite with, and who are actually at this time united with the Indians in their murderous excursions. It is a fact that most of our male Negroes on the seaboard are restless and make many attempts to get to St. Augustine," close quote. In another correspondence between Mitchell and Monroe, he also pointed out the fact that it was the black freedom fighters in Florida that were acting as the true defenders of the territory, because they seemingly had more to lose if Florida were to be handed over to the U.S. Mitchell stated that, indeed, the principal strength of the garrison at St. Augustine consists of Negroes. Mitchell also complained that the so-called use of Africans was not fair, and he compared the war with the Africans to the Haitian Revolution. In addition, planter John McIntosh, and now the Directory of the Patriots, wrote to Secretary Monroe that, quote, "Our slaves are excited to rebel, and we have an army of Negroes raked up in this country and brought from Cuba to be contended with. St. Augustine, the whole province will be the refuge of fugitive slaves, and from thence emissaries will be detached to bring about the revolt of the black population of the United States." Close quote. As the Patriot War proceeded, the blacks and the natives continued to keep the invaders at bay. But it was the ambush at 12 Mile Swamp, just north of Fort Mose, that demoralized the U.S. troops, and which served as the beginning of the end for the so-called Patriots. Now let's go down the road to 12 Mile Swamp to see if there are any acknowledgments of this victory by the Africans. Well, we are here at 12 Mile Swamp, and there seems to be, once again, no acknowledgement of any African maroon activity in this area of Florida. No sign of rebellion, no sign of an ambush against U.S. military, nothing. This is a pretty park, though, and the thousands of people that pass through this park would have no idea of what had taken place here. "12 Mile Swamp Recreation Area." Well, there is this one sign here, but this sign says nothing about history or anything else related to the Maroons or anything like that. So yeah, this park here completely ignores
How you doing?
the reality of African
Fine,
resistance.
thanks.
Most American accounts and media attributed the successful ambush on the U.S. troops to the Native Americans. But the Spanish governor of Florida stated actually that our parties are blacks, whom they, the rebels, think are Indians because they wear the same clothing and go painted. Though government officials corresponded openly about the African presence in Florida and their fight against the U.S. Marines and Georgia militiamen, the media intentionally kept this information from the public. After it was realized that the indigenous and the Africans were demonstrating successfully that they could repel this invasion, and the U.S. had to focus on Britain, James Madison and Secretary of State Monroe realized that this move was a complete failure and stopped supporting it. By 1813, the Africans had defeated U.S. Marines and Georgia volunteers in the Patriot War. However, though the Africans may have won the battles, the relentless United States was attempting to see to it that they did not win the war. Many of the African freedom fighters living in the northeast corner of East Florida migrated westward toward the Suwannee and Apalachicola rivers and south towards the Tampa Bay area in order to avoid the depredations of the United States kidnappers, who have been euphemistically referred to as slave owners or planters. These Africans established villages throughout the aforementioned locations and defended them. And with war officially being waged between the United States and Britain between 1812 and 1814, the blacks and the natives were armed by the British to fight against the supposed land of the free and justice, the United States of America. What has been referred to as the War of 1812 consisted not only of the United States defending themselves against a British takeover, but also of robbing natives of their land and stripping self-emancipating Africans of their freedom. In 1813, under the command of General Andrew Jackson, who would later become the 7th President of the United States, the Creek natives near the southern border of present-day Alabama were in the process of losing their land to the U.S. invaders. The Creek were divided into the Red Sticks on the one hand, who were against the expansion of the United States and the enslavement of their African American allies, and the Lower Creek, who had adopted many of the European ways from being in such close contact with them for years. This Creek War ultimately ended with the Red Stick Creek losing 23 million acres of land in present-day southern Alabama and Georgia. This reality for the Red Sticks, however, grew them even closer to the Africans in the area. In addition, as the British vacated their Florida fort at Prospect Bluff, they left the fort and the ammunition behind for the Black freedom fighters. This fort, along the Apalachicola River, was referred to as none other than Negro Fort. Here we are now at Prospect Bluff Historic Sites. This is where we took our next trip. We're on our way to Fort Gaston. Walls here is an old fort that used to be referred to as Loma de Buena Vista by the Spanish, Fort Nichols by the British, but Negro Fort when the runaway slaves came. The self-emancipating Africans came and took the fort over after the War of 1812. And what happened was during the War of 1812, the British were looking for allies. They were looking for Native American allies, African allies, and any ally that they can find to fight against the United States government. What ended up happening was the runaway slaves and the Native Americans decided, we're going to fight on the side of the British because your enemy's enemy is your ally. And they did so. But after the War of 1812 was over and the British lost this war, they left the fort, Fort Nichols, to the blacks. And they named it Negro Fort. Negro Fort became a place where hundreds of Africans ended up residing and fighting and protecting their freedom. And not only were they fighting and protecting their own freedom within the fort and right around the fort, but hundreds of runaway slaves continued to escape into Florida and seek the defense and the protection of those who were living in Negro Fort. So by 1815 and 1816, you had a series of maroon villages surrounding this whole entire area here of about 800 self-emancipating Africans who had their own villages, growing their own pumpkin, growing their own corn, raising their own livestock, living free and fighting for their freedom. And this is the location in which those in Negro Fort defended and protected the area. The revolutionaries living at Negro Fort were a mixture of Africans and American-born blacks. Some of them retained names such as Congo Tom, Carlos Congo, or Carlos Mayumbe. There were others like Abraham, who would go on to play a vital role in the Seminole Wars in the future. Some of the runaways were listed as literate, sailors, master carpenters, coopers, ironsmiths, bakers, laundresses, cooks, sawyers, masons, cartwrights, and field hands. Based on their classifications, these Africans' diverse backgrounds hardly made them an inadequate group of freedom fighters. As historian Jane Landers noted, they were certainly equipped to be self-sufficient. The general of Negro Fort was a 30-year-old runaway carpenter by the name of Garçon, who was claimed by a Don Antonio Montero. This fort was equipped with 10 cannons, several thousand muskets and sidearms, ammunition, and military stores. These Africans were well trained and ready for war. This fort, General Andrew Jackson and others started to view as a serious threat because they were recruiting African soldiers from the southern plantations. Correspondences between the top military officials proves this. In a letter from March 15, 1816, from the Secretary of War to General Andrew Jackson, it stated, quote, "Sir, it appears from the representation of Colonel Hawkins that the Negro fort erected during the war has been strengthened since that period, and now occupied by between 250 and 300 blacks, who are well armed, clothed, and disciplined." The Secretary of War also stated, "Secret practices to inveigle Negroes from the frontiers of Georgia are still continued by the Negroes and the hostile Creeks. This is a state of things which cannot fail to produce much injury to the neighboring settlements and excite irritations which may ultimately endanger the peace of the nation. Should it be determined that the destruction of the fort does not require the sanction of the legislature, measures will be promptly taken for its reduction." In another letter on March 20th, 1816, from General Edmund Gaines, where Gainesville gets its name, to Jackson, the general states, "If intercourse could be opened down the Apalachicola, it would enable us to keep an eye upon the Seminoles and the Negro fort. The Negro establishment is, I think justly, considered as likely to produce much evil among the blacks of Georgia and the eastern part of the Mississippi Territory. Will you permit me to break it up?" General Andrew Jackson responded with, quote, "If they are stealing and enticing away our Negroes, they ought to be viewed as a band of outlaws, land pirates, and ought to be destroyed." Close quote. A lot of the runaway slaves that were in the area here would continue to raid plantations in southern Georgia for tools, for weapons, and even encouraging other runaway slaves to continue to leak down into Florida. Now, the thing was this. A lot of the planters were starting to compare Negro fort and the depredations of the Africans here in Florida to Saint-Domingue, also known as Haiti. They did not want another Haiti on their hands. In fact, they tried to keep it a secret in the media. They didn't want anybody to be too fearful about what was actually going on over here, and that you had African warriors fighting and protecting and defending their freedom. But the reality was this. As time went on, more and more runaway slaves continued to come down into Florida and build to this new society that was existing here in this area, right around Prospect Bluff. On July 17, 1816, the Black Revolutionaries engaged in a bloody battle resulting in the death of 5 U.S. Navy men. The U.S. military soon realized that Negro Fort was well protected in the land routes to the fort. This is when Andrew Jackson made the decision to attack by water. On July 27, 1816, 2 U.S. gunboats sailed up the Apalachicola River. Commander Garçon vied to blow up the fort on his own rather than surrender. But in the meantime, Garçon and his men continued to put up a fight. The Africans launched cannon shots in the direction of the gunboats coming up the stream. In response, the U.S. gunboat miraculously launched a shot that hit the powder magazine in the fort, destroying the entire fort. So, the American troops came in across the Apalachicola River, and they shoot a cannon into the Negro fort, killing about 270 people, men, women, and children. And as a result, a lot of the Africans that were in this fort had to disperse. But you still had a series of maroon villages extending from this area here, all the way down across Lake Miccosukee, all the way down, extending all the way down into the Suwannee River, all the way down into central Florida. But this was in 1816. This was the summer of 1816 where this happened. And this is a very important location for the African freedom fighters of Florida. Of the approximately 300 people that were in the fort, only about 40 of them survived. Garçon was later captured and executed. Abraham, from Pensacola, was able to escape. Some of these refugees from Negro Fort were able to make their way to the Suwannee River and establish maroon villages where we will take our next trip. Welcome to Suwannee River State Park, the location of the Battle of Suwannee of 1818, where the Maroons of Florida battled the United States government for their freedom. And here we are at the Suwannee River National Park in North Florida. And typical of the history of Florida, there's no mention of the wars that were going on along the Suwannee River when Andrew Jackson and his troops went down into Florida along the Suwannee River to destroy maroon villages. History talks a little bit about Native Americans, talks about Spanish explorers, Confederate soldiers, but nothing about the maroon, self-emancipating Africans who fought for their freedom along these waters here, along the Suwannee River. Here we are in the evening. The Suwannee River. All along the edges of this river existed maroon communities, self-emancipating Africans who established themselves some villages all along this river here. Way back in the early 1800s and late 1700s. These villages lasted here up until Andrew Jackson, who became our 7th president of the United States, invaded Florida in what we call the First Seminole War and was able to destroy these maroon villages. And these Africans fled further south into Florida to establish other communities throughout Central and South Florida. Maroons were able to seek refuge further south along the Suwannee River in Billy Bowleg's town after the destruction of Negro Fort. Right here we are at the Suwannee River, where a lot of Black Seminole activity happened, where a lot of the Maroons actually established themselves villages here in North Florida. Now the way the story goes, if you go all the way back to after 1816 when Negro Fort was destroyed, you had a lot of Africans that ended up moving into what's known as Foul Town. Foul Town is a place where a lot of the Red Stick Creeks also lived in South Georgia. These Creeks and enslaved or formerly enslaved Africans continued to invade and raid plantations to get the things that they needed in order to sustain themselves and to protect themselves from those white invaders. Well, what ends up happening is this. In 1817, the federal government decided they'd had enough. And they said, we have to find a way to stop these Africans from invading in the same way that they had to do with the Negro Fort. So they decided to surround and burn down the whole entire Foul Town village that consisted of Indians and African people. Well, what the Indians and Africans did as a result, they ended up going to Fort Scott and massacring 43 people, including men, women, and children. A lot of these Africans ended up retreating down into Florida as a result. They ended up living along here, the Suwannee River, in these villages that you see along the coast, along the side here of this river. Villages were established all along this area here. of Maroons. They called it Africa Town, all right? And it was under the leadership of one of the Maroons known as Billy Bowlegs. Now, these Africans had to face the onslaught of troops of the United States government, including future President Andrew Jackson. When Andrew Jackson came in here in 1817 and 1818 to fight the Battle of Suwannee, he ended up burning down a lot of what was known as Africa Town right here along the Suwannee River. But this didn't go without any real punishment to the United States government, because there were a lot of U.S. troops lost in the process. And as a matter of fact, some descendants of Black Seminoles have a completely different account of actually what took place in these battles.
In 1972, Professor of History Jan Carew interviewed a descendant of the Black Seminoles living in Andros Island, Bahamas. The elderly woman stated, quote, "I heard about that battle of Suwannee against Stonewall Jackson. My grandmother tell me about it, and her grandmother tell her about it long before. She tell me how the old ones used to talk about the look on them white soldiers' faces when they see black fighters looking like they grow out of the swamp, grass, and the hammocks, coming at them with guns and cutlass. Jackson get hurt at Suwannee, man. The ancestors brutalized him there. He run away and never come back to face blacks and Seminoles fighting shoulder to shoulder. Black flesh touching red and brown. That kind of thing does give the white man nightmare and day fever all at the same time." The old lady went on to talk about how cruel Andrew Jackson was in his attempt to enslave black people who had been free for generations down in Florida. After Jackson engaged with the natives and Africans at the Battle of Suwannee, he went on to take over the Spanish post at Pensacola and St. Mark's. A combination of losses accrued during this war and the Spanish preoccupation with the Napoleonic Wars in Europe compelled the once formidable European nation to surrender Florida to the United States in 1819 under the Adams-Onis Treaty, officially becoming a U.S. territory by 1821. However, though the Spanish had given up Florida, the Africans and the natives continued to fight for their land. After the hard-fought battle between the Maroons and the U.S. government at the Suwannee River, many of the Africans fled farther south into Florida. Many of them would seek refuge in Pilaclicaja, a Maroon town in present-day Sumter County that was headed by Black Seminole Chief Abraham. But hundreds escaped farther south on the west coast of Florida to a community known as Angola, just outside of Sarasota, where we will take our next trip.
El iguanado quiere yeun. El iguanado quiere yeun. Quiere yeun nado a colorizar. El iguanado quiere yeun. El iguanado quiere yeun nado a colorizar. El iguanado quiere yeun. El iguanado quiere yeun. Quiere yeun nado a colorizar. El iguanado quiere yeun. El iguanado quiere yeun. Quiere yeun nado a colorizar. El iguanado quiere yeun. El iguanado quiere yeun. Quiere yeun nado a colorizar.
Welcome to Angola, the Maroon community that was established in the early 1800s and fell to its demise by the year 1821. We got the Curry Homestead. It says Refuge of Peace. The Curry Homestead, including the Manatee Mineral Spring, is ground steeped in history. Pre-Columbian mounds stood here. As a Spanish territory until 1821, blacks seeking freedom from enslavement headed south into Florida. Border skirmishes and slave raids caused men, women, and children to seek safer havens south of the Manatee River. right over there. At Angola, this whole area here would have been this Angola community, a spot on Florida's Underground Railroad that has been documented by archaeological evidence. In 1821, it was destroyed in a large slave raid. Hundreds were captured, but some escaped to the Bahamas or the interior of Florida to a place called Manatee, and that's where they went further into the interior in a place where it's present-day Polk County. In 1864, Union sailors came ashore and destroyed the Curry sawmill, grist mill. In August 1864, under the leadership of Captain John Bartolf, 40 to 60 soldiers of the 2nd Colored Infantry camped on this site. So this is steeped in very, very rich history. Remember, after you had the Patriot War, you had a lot of Maroon communities outside of St. Augustine. A lot of them ended up fleeing farther west and farther south. And it was here that many of them escaped to. They established a community here. The community was referred to as Angola because a lot of Cuban fishermen actually referred to this community as Angola, because I think it's probably because there were a lot of Africans in Cuba that actually referred to themselves as Angola or as Congo people, because they had a large influx of Africans that were shipped into Cuba at the time. The Maroon community here, they said it was about 750 plus Maroons living in this area here. And they did all the other things that the other Maroons did in other communities. They grew their own food, they grew their own, they had their own livestock. They engaged in trade all along the banks of the river here, leading out to the bay, to Tampa Bay. And they traded with fishermen, Spanish fishermen from Cuba. They traded with other fishermen from other places like the Bahamas. And they really engaged and thrived in a lifestyle here to defend and protect their freedom, just like the other Maroon communities had done. But it was in 1821, as we know, that Andrew Jackson sent his people in here to come and conquer this area. And a lot of them were actually captured and sold into slavery, but many of them still escaped. Many of them escaped to Andros Island in 1821. And they ended up establishing a community over there. That's there till this day. Now, if you think about it, 1821 is also the same time that many of them escaped farther inland and established themselves, that community in Manatee, all right, in Polk County. And they were under the leadership of what has been referred to as a black settlement by the name of Capone. Right, here we are. Feel the Congo ancestors, the Angolan ancestors here, and this region in Florida where the self-emancipating Africans fought for their freedom. Can you believe that, man? And this is a history that they don't teach us, man. They don't teach us this stuff, man. This is rich. Rich. The Maroon community's name, Angola, is a country in present-day West Central Africa, in which the name comes from the Kimbundu word meaning king. The term came to be applied to everyone from the Kimbundu-speaking region outside of the city of Luanda. In some cases, the term Angola was also generically used to even refer to those Africans coming from the Kingdom of the Congo to the north. Nevertheless, like that of Haiti, Florida's Maroon culture was very heavily influenced by the West Central African culture, also referred to as Bantu culture. As in the other parts of Florida, these Bantu Africans of Angola created a community that stretched from the Manatee River to Sarasota Bay. Virtually forgotten for almost 200 years, this Angola Maroon community within the past 5 years has received recognition from the city of Bradenton and a team of historians and archaeologists who are now excavating the land in search of the hidden past. The term Angola was first seen in historic records after Andrew Jackson invaded Florida with his Creek Indian allies to take over the land from the Africans and the natives. When claims were made to certain lands by white settlers whose residence preceded the invasion by the U.S.,
Cuban fishermen made false claims to the land along the Manatee River where the Maroons lived, referring to this land as Angola in the official record books. Before their Maroon community was burned to the ground, they thrived independently while maintaining trade with the Caribbean. So this is the Manatee Mineral Spring, and all along these banks here, all the way into there, maybe dozens of acres inland, you would have had the Angola Maroon community would have lived all around here. And this is where they would have fished from. This is where they would have traded with other nations, traded with the Spanish out of Cuba, traded with the British out of the Bahamas. And this is it. And, the Angolan community, it has the name Angola, and a lot of people were actually obviously from Central Africa, the Congo-Angola region, but that doesn't mean that these were the only Africans that lived in this area. So these people brought with them their culture, they brought with them their customs or traditions of raising food, of cultivation, and they thrived for a long time. And the sad thing is, when we think of the United States of America, and people generally think that this is the land of the free and the home of the brave, but everywhere the United States government went, including this place here, they were essentially taking away the freedom of other people. So wherever the U.S. spread to, whether it was in Alabama during the Creek Wars, or whether it was Florida during the Seminole Wars with the Maroons and the Red Seminoles, or whether it was acquiring the land of Texas, back when Texas was a part of Mexico, a place where abolished slavery way back in 1829. Wherever America went, slavery went, and chattel slavery continued to spread. And the creation of Florida, and this is something that we need to keep in mind, the creation of the state of Florida, in essence, was the creation of a place that was draconian and stripping away the freedom of thousands upon thousands of people. And at one time, this area, this peninsula, in the southern part of the North American continent, was a land of freedom. And as Jackson sent his people down in here, 1821, people from here dispersed. They went to places like the Bahamas, they went to places like Andros Island. To this day, you find the descendants of them there. They ended up going to Cuba. And then some of them went farther inland to a place called Manatee. That's in Polk County. So we're gonna go check out Manatee in a little bit. So let's go check it out. Polk County. Peace. We learned that the Polk County Maroon community was referred to as Manatee, and it was located near Lake Hancock. We also discovered that Lake Hancock was near a museum that dedicates a portion of its exhibits to the Seminoles. So, logically, we had to stop there to see what they say about the African Revolution in Florida. Welcome to Polk County Historical Museum. Here we are. Now that we're at the museum, let's see what we can find about those Africans that fled Angola to what is now Polk County in the year 1821. Exhibition guide. See if they got any Seminole history here, or Black Seminole history. Oh, over here. I recognize that. Seminole dolls, beaded leather medicine and tobacco bags. Seminole or Miccosukee shirt. African-American settlements. Early black settlements in Polk County were established to house workers who came to the area for opportunities with the phosphate, turpine, railroad, and citrus industry. Segregation made it necessary for blacks to have separate living quarters, and many of these quarters expanded into thriving communities by the early 20th century. Below are some of the settlements in Polk County that grew into established communities. See, what this doesn't take into consideration is all of the different black settlements that were actually here, the maroon communities that were here prior to the Civil War. See, they kind of have a tendency to separate the Indians from the Africans, right? Over here, they're talking about the Native American conflicts, the Seminole Wars, not emphasizing that they are too African Americans, right? African Americans in early Polk County. Florida had long served as a destination. Oh, so they do mention it here. Florida had long served as a destination for runaway slaves, while little is known about the Polk County region prior to the 1830s. Military reports in 1832 identify the village of Manatee, which is Manatee, near Bartow. That's where we're going to go check out in a little bit, as having black settlers. Runaway slaves who joined Seminole communities also became known as black Seminoles. So this is where, when they left the Angola community by Sarasota, when that was destroyed in 1821, many of them actually came to this area that we're in right here in Bartow. In 1861, 31 families in Polk County possessed 143 slaves. Few accounts of slavery in the region, particularly from the slave's perspective, are available for interpretation. From what is known, it does not appear the experience matched that of plantation slavery across the South. Yeah, so this little section we have right here is the extent of which there's black record of an existence in this area prior to the Civil War. But I guess, how can you fault people? Can you fault the historians for not knowing about this? Not really, because, like I said before, the essence of their existence was contingent upon not being detected. But as archaeologists and researchers are starting to actually do more discoveries, they're starting to find out that the extent at which black communities actually did live here and find freedom by fighting against the U.S. government since the 18th century all the way into the 19th century. But it seems as though this museum, like many others, make a distinction between the history of the Seminole Wars and what the contemporary generals referred to as the Negro Wars. Yeah, you have the first Seminole War in North Florida, and the second Seminole War, which was closer to Central Florida. Then you have President Zachary Taylor instructs the military to remove all Native Americans from Central Florida. See, there's no mention there of the Africans that were actually asked to be removed as well. They're actually pushing to remove them for a very long time. No mention of this in the Indian section. And it's all of this, still, no mention. No mention. There are really not that many blacks here at this time during the Third Seminole War. They've all been moved. When you read down all this section here, you really don't see any mention of this connection between African Americans, Seminoles, fighting for liberation. Talking about remaining Indians, Miccosukee. They say Seminoles, but they put it in an Indian section separate from everything else. So this is why there's this misconception that these blacks didn't fight for their freedom, because they're always often portrayed as being something separate from, red Seminoles. Well, we at least saw a manatee acknowledged in the museum. Let's go to Lake Hancock and see if there is any recognition of the Maroon community there. As we were driving down the road looking for Lake Hancock, and what the maps described as the location where the Manatee Maroon community would have been, we realized that the road came to a dead end. However, we were fortunate enough to meet Ryan King, whose family owns the farmland in the exact location that the Maroon community existed.
Oh, that's why they call it Peace River. That's correct. It used to be called Peace River.
Can we record you? Because we're actually doing a film.
For history. For history. No, that was perfect, man. We were doing a historical thing.
I'm a history teacher, but I don't know someone like
That's crazy, man. You ran into the perfect guy. That's amazing.
But that's how Peace River got named. They could not pronounce Peace Creek. Wow. Had a huge plantation here on this side of the lake. And it was just really cool stuff happened here a long time ago.
So what I was reading, and I'm doing like a study on the red Seminole and the black Seminole.
He was a black Seminole.
So opponent was a black Seminole.
That's exactly right.
So I wasn't sure which one he was, but I read that after Andrew Jackson sent the red sticks into
down here, pushed them all the way down to Charlotte, and he pushed them farther again.
Yeah. So he was in. So we're gonna go to Sarasota to visit the old Angola, and then he pushed them all over here to the lake out right there. This is it right here.
This is it. This is the spot. If you want, I'll come take you and show you the hill.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. It's got a burn pile on it right now, but I can show you a spot where the hill is.
Okay,
it's the highest point of elevation on this side of the lake. It just happens to be on our family's property.
So you know all this history.
My dad knows way more than I do. I haven't had time or the intuition to look into it. I'm more of a farm guy, getting this stuff done, get it grown, but he knows a lot more about it than I do. I know bits and parts and pieces and can kind of put the story together to some degree, but he can tell you a lot more.
Yeah. So you want to grab your, can we fly the drone?
You say you can drive?
Oh, we can drive,
yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, all right. If you want to.
I'd love to.
I'll back up, just follow this road in. You'll come up to a couple of barns, just park right there. I'll dust you out.
Okay.
You follow me, and it's real dusty right now.
Okay.
I'll back up.
Thank you. house. I suddenly got the feeling that we're about to get Texas Chainsaw.
I know, right? We are now at Apone Farms, named after Chief Apone, one of the Seminoles. And this is where the Black Seminoles escaped to in 1821. So this is the location that the Black Seminoles, after they left the Sarasota region in the community of Angola near Tampa Bay in 1821, when Andrew Jackson sent troops and Red Creek Native Americans to this region. Or sorry, when he actually sent Creek Native Americans as well as some U.S. soldiers to this region to scatter the Black Seminoles from this area. Many of those Black Seminoles who were actually trading with people, with Cubans and other fishermen on the coast, were pushed into the interior. This is the interior that they actually went to. This location here, they established new settlements known as Manatee, or also known as Manatee. This whole entire region, we are on the location exactly where the Black Seminoles lived, where the maroon communities were pushed to after they left Angola. Our friend Ryan King was so gracious enough to let us on his property, 80 acres of land, to actually get access to the lake, where you see a lot of the Seminoles, a lot of the Maroons will usually find areas near water to live so they can fish and so they can hunt and do all kinds of things and still live freely.
According to history, this is the highest point of elevation on this side of Lake Hancock, and this is where Chief Apone's homestead was. He had a 2-story log home here, and he farmed squash, zucchini, peas, peaches, and the list goes on of different commodities that were grown here. He also had 300 to 400 slaves that lived on the north end of the lake on Saddle Creek. Back in that direction, they came back, and they're the people that cultivated his crops for him. You know, wow. The Peace River was actually called Pease River, but the white man could not pronounce peas, so that's how it's got its name, Peace River. That's the gist of that.
Interesting.
This is some of, I don't know, it's just God's country, untouched, Lake Hancock. There's no homes that are on the lake. It's a natural in its state, one of the last lakes, I believe, in the state to be like this in its own natural form.
And this out here, this is like pristine beauty. Like if you guys are actually out here and you can feel like the breeze off the lake, you can hear the birds out here. We see peacocks, we see bald eagles and everything like that. Like this is like pure beauty out here. But this is the location that Chief Apone actually lived right here. So we actually got like the inside scoop here from Mr. King.
These slaves that King speaks of would have been former slaves at this point. I was pleased to find out that the King family knew about this history. The U.S. Army tried their best to keep the Africans and the natives from trading on the coast. In addition to Manatee's population growing after the destruction of Angola, there were other significant maroon communities that were also thriving in the 1820s and 30s. One of them was none other than Abrahamstown, named after a lazy-eyed African man who was born around 1790 in either Georgia or Pensacola and escaped slavery right around the time of the War of 1812, and was instrumental in every major maroon war against the U.S. government since the Negro Fort.
Welcome to Pilaklakia, also known as Abrahamstown. over here to this side. This side of the sign, this is supposed to represent where the black Seminole or Maroon by the name of Abraham once lived. You go on this side, this sign talks about, more generally speaking, it actually does give recognition to the black Seminoles, unlike a lot of other places around here that are associated with the fight for freedom and independence. But this one says, 1 mile east of here is the site of the town of Pilaclicaja. So that would be like, I think in that direction somewhere. It's established in 1813 by black Seminoles, meaning many ponds in the Miccosukee language. Pilaclicaja was the largest and most prosperous black Seminole town in Florida with a population of 100 men. I dispute that to a certain extent because there's other Maroon towns that had hundreds of more people than that. But it says, women and children. Many black Seminoles were formerly enslaved peoples of African descent who fled bondage to Spanish Florida following the American Revolution. Driven into Alachua and Sewanee regions by Georgia and Tennessee militias, they joined and mingled with the native Seminoles. Black Seminoles, though not formally adopted into the Seminole tribe, formed a relationship with the native Seminoles who protected them from slave catchers in exchange for military aid and a portion of their crops as tribute. See, this is one of the things that I also wanted to mention, is that a lot of the Seminoles that I read were actually they were hunters. The Red Seminoles were more so hunters. They did engage in sedentary farming and things like that, but a lot of the black Seminoles of African descent actually specialized in agriculture. So a lot of the crops that they were growing in a town like this, like melon and squash and all kinds of other things, and also raising livestock, they ended up supplementing whatever it was that the natives were actually producing for themselves with hunting. So they kind of had this coexisting symbiotic relationship between the Red Seminoles and the Black Seminoles. And when the Red Seminoles needed food crops in order to sustain themselves, especially in this precarious time of the whites constantly trying to take their land away, the Black Seminoles were always there with farming, with livestock and food crops to be able to help exchange. And this relationship between the two enabled them to really survive and thrive during this time. But it also says here, at its peak, Pilaclicaja contained timber, thatch, and dog homes, corn cribs, and fences. Residents may have accumulated few possessions beyond simple dishes, arms, beads, and handmade brushed pottery. During the 1820s, the settlement was visited by two American officials, Horatio Dexter and Lieutenant George McCall, who reported herds of cattle and horses along with fields of rice, beans, melons, pumpkins, and peanuts, as I mentioned. So they were growing their own food and surviving and sustaining themselves in spite of the constant aggression by slave catchers and the U.S. military. On this side, it's more specific to Abraham. All right, so what the sign says here, Pilaclicaja was known as Abraham's Old Town, named after Abraham, the Maroon that I was talking about, who came to the area after escaping slavery in Pensacola around 1826. Now, I'm challenging this year here because 1826, I've never read in any source that he escaped slavery in 1826. Everything I've read shows that he escaped slavery sometime in the very early 1800s. And as a matter of fact, Abraham, according to a lot of records, was actually involved in Negro Fort way back in 1816. He'd been a runaway, so that means he's been a runaway since before 1826. He was also involved in the First Seminole War in the towns that were under Billy Bowlegs along the Sewanee River. He was also involved in that as well. And Abraham, in addition to that, was one of those guys that helped establish this area here back in 1813. So, well, I don't know if he's has helped establish this area in 1813, because in 1813, Abraham would have still been farther north along the Sewanee River, helping to fight and defeat Andrew Jackson in the Battle of Sewanee. But at least after 1818, when a lot of the Maroons continued to go farther and farther south into Florida, because remember, with this area being established in 1813, that coincides with the Patriot War. The Patriot War was mostly in the northeast part of Florida. So a lot of the Maroons that were in and around St. Augustine or Fort Mose, they started to spread farther and farther south. This is where they would have established a village here. Abraham probably would have joined in after the first Seminole War which ended in 1818. Abraham would have come here. He would have been free for a long time. And being here, now I'm realizing, because as we came to this area, I noticed that there was a Dade Massacre historic park. I thought that the Dade Massacre occurred, or actually happened a lot closer to Fort King. But it's actually, we're about 30 miles away from Fort King in Ocala right now. And the Dade Massacre Historic Park is actually probably about 5 minutes away from here, maybe 5 to 10 minutes away from here. So this might have been the town that assisted in the Dade Massacre that actually happened, where they killed 100 U.S. soldiers. Because the records that I've read in books like this is actually supposed to be a depiction of Abraham in Florida's Negro War, Black Seminoles and the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842, written by Anthony Dixon. This book depicts Abraham as being crucial to this fight, the Dade Massacre and the Second Seminole War. Abraham they said he was born in Pensacola, but as he came up and as he started to get more and more involved with Chief Micanopy, with Billy Bowlegs, who my brother thinks is funny, and it's a funny name, you see that he actually started to get really high in the rankings with the Seminoles, and he served as an interpreter. You see, they call him an interpreter, but I actually beg to differ, because I think one of the things was this: whenever the Seminoles met with the United States government, when they went to Washington to meet, any black that was negotiating with the Seminoles usually relegated them, and I think for strategic purposes, to just being interpreters or slaves or servants of these Seminoles, when in reality they were equals. They had their own established villages. Abraham's town, you had Cujo's town, you had all these different black maroon villages that were coexisting as almost like a confederacy of separate communities or nations within a nation that were fighting for their freedom. And so they usually, in the secondary sources, usually find, and not only secondary sources, but in the primary sources, they usually diminish and belittle the importance of people like Abraham in their fight and in their struggle for freedom and independence. But this is the location, this area here would have been where Abraham's town was. But if we continue on, Abraham served as a skilled interpreter, and the voice of the Seminoles during the treaty negotiations with the United States government. He rose to prominence as the counselor of Chief Micanopy, even accompanying him on diplomatic trip to Washington, D.C. Abraham was later released from service in appreciation for his work. See, they say he was released from service. As once again, they're minimizing his role as an independent free person. Assuming a connection to the Dade Massacre in 1835, United States Army soldiers under the command of Brigadier General Abraham Eustis burned Pilaclicaha to the ground on March 30th, 1836. So this is the village that they assume was actually Abraham also was instrumental in, along with this African by the name of John Caesar. They were both instrumental in creating connections between Maroons or Black Seminoles and enslaved Africans on plantations, in the newly formed plantations that was popping up all over Florida, the sugar plantations and the cotton plantations. So they made these clandestine networks that contributed to the rise of these major slave revolts going on all throughout Central and East Florida, and it also contributed to the destruction of the sugar plantations. Out of the 22 sugar plantations that were established in this very lucrative business in Florida in the 1830s, 21 of them were destroyed. And you can thank Abraham, John Caesar, and others who made connections with the enslaved on the plantations for this kind of thing.
According to Black Seminole historian Anthony Dixon, Abraham was likely to have been born into slavery on a Georgia plantation and was sold to a Dr. Sierra in Pensacola, where he escaped at a young age. After fighting in the Battle of Negro Fort and the Battle of Suwanee, he had proven himself to be an intelligent freedom fighter. He was referred to by other Black Seminoles as the Prophet or the Sense Bearer. He was admired by and became the chief counselor to Chief Micanopy, whose name can be found all over Florida today. Abraham
and Maroons such as John Caballo, also known as John Horse, would be instrumental in spearheading the Second Seminole War with their participation in the Dade Massacre in 1835. However, in the years leading up to this major event, the Maroon communities such as Manatee, Abrahamstown, and Cujostown were growing after the destruction of the coastal Maroon communities to prevent the prosperous trade with their Caribbean neighbors. Special interest groups under the U.S. government were interested in converting Florida into another profitable slave state. After the U.S. military ravaged the coastal regions of Florida, on September 18, 1823, some Seminole leaders signed the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, which ceded all claims in Florida except for a reservation located miles away and cut off from the sea. Article 7 of this treaty stated, quote, "The chiefs and warriors, aforesaid, stipulate to be active and vigilant in the preventing the retreating to, or passing through, the district of country assigned, of any absconding slaves or fugitives from justice, and deliver the same agent who shall receive orders to compensate them agreeably to the trouble and expense incurred." These major black communities of Maroons were not exempted from the stipulations in the treaty. Many of the Red Seminoles had no intention of honoring this portion of the treaty of returning runaway slaves. Doing so would be suicide. Those natives who did honor the treaty were in conflict with those that did not. However, Maroons that were captured and returned to U.S. officials, if they escaped again, were typically left alone by the natives. By the 1820s, the black Seminole communities were becoming more formidable and influential. This was a dire time when the encroachment of the U.S. invaders was on the horizon. The expansive slave trade in the United States was making its way into the free land of Florida, and the African American Maroon communities worked diligently to prevent this from occurring. In 1826, the United States Governor of Florida, William Pope Duval, wrote a letter to the Red Seminoles trying to discourage them from associating with the African revolutionaries. Quote, "You are not to mind what the Negroes say. They will lie and lead you astray in the hope to escape their white owners, and that you will give them refuge and hide them. Do your duty and give them up. They care nothing for you, further than to make use of you, to keep you out of the hands of their masters." Close quote. Duval, in an attempt to instill a divide between the Red Seminoles and the blacks, wrote that, quote, "Thus far the Negroes have made you their tools and gained a protection, contrary to both justice and the treaty, and, at the same time, laugh at you for being deceived by them. Deliver them up, rid your nation of a serious pest, and do what, as an honest man, you should do. Then your white brothers will say you have done them justice, like honest, good men." Close quote. It was clear that the majority of the Red Seminoles had no intentions of giving up their black Seminole African Maroon revolutionary brethren. Despite this unity between the natives and the Africans, the federal government had different plans when they announced their Indian Removal Act. And Abrahamstown, in close proximity to Fort King, would be key in spearheading the largest slave revolt in U.S. history, known by many as the Second Seminole War, but referred to by contemporaries as the Negro War. And it is Fort King where we will be taking our next trip. Welcome to Fort King. So the way the story goes, in 1821, we already know that Florida was now ceded to the United States from Spain. A lot of the Maroon villages like Africa Town and Negro Fort and all these villages had been crushed, they'd been destroyed. So Africans were moving farther and farther south into Florida. Angola was also destroyed in 1821 by Sarasota. Africans were moving to other parts. You had a maroon village near here known as Cujo Town. Kojo is an Akande name that's for people that are actually born on Mondays. So you can see there's an African presence here. But what ended up happening was in 1830, Andrew Jackson and Congress, they signed off on the Indian Removal Act. And part of the Indian Removal Act was to remove the Seminole Indians from Florida. In 1832, they came up with the Treaty of Payne's Landing, and the treaty was originally designed to actually have the natives sign this treaty and agree to give up the land and move out west into Oklahoma. Well, some Seminole natives actually agreed to it, but there were a lot of them that did not. One of them that did not agree to it was Micanopy, Chief Micanopy, who is closer to Gainesville. And another one that did not agree to it was Osceola. As time went on, a few years later, one of the Indian agents named Wiley Thompson actually kidnapped one of the wives of Osceola. The wife of Osceola was actually an African woman, a black woman. He was very upset about this, and for a very, very long time he started to complain vociferously about the fact that he felt like the land was getting taken away, they kidnapped his wife, and he actually wanted revenge. Before Osceola can get revenge, they actually locked him up, and they imprisoned him right here in Fort King. This very location, Osceola would have been locked up, and after 2 days, Agent Thompson, Wiley Thompson, said, "If you calm down, I'll let you out." Osceola calmed down. Eventually, Osceola was released. Well, little did they know that after releasing Osceola, he planned to get revenge on Agent Wiley Thompson. December 28th, 1835, Osceola and a few of his comrades, they killed and scalped Agent Wiley Thompson. Not only that, but they killed 5 others that were actually located outside of this Fort King post. But while this was going on simultaneously, there was a group of troops, about 100 U.S. soldiers coming from Fort Brooke near Tampa Bay, coming towards here, Fort King, to provide sustenance and to relieve some of the soldiers that were located here. On their way up here, there was an ambush. Seminole Indians, as well as Africans, had come and surrounded these 100 U.S. soldiers and killed them all, massacred all of them. First, the Indians came up and started in this battle, engaged in the battle, and killed many of them. And then the Africans, they said 40 or 50 Africans on horseback came.
Even though it wasn't originally part of the trip, we had to make a stop at the location of the Dade Massacre, about 30 minutes to the south of Fort King, in Sumter County.
Welcome to Dade Battlefield Historic State Park, the location in which the Maroons and Red Seminoles massacred over 100 U.S. soldiers to spearhead the Second Seminole War.
As Major Francis Dade was en route with his 105 soldiers to relieve those at Fort King, he brought with him hounds, who were most likely slave hunting dogs. As the troops were ambushed by the Red Seminoles, the initial volley of shots were targeted towards the officers. The U.S. soldiers responded with shots from their muskets and cannons until they ran out of ammunition. This is when an estimated 50 African warriors arrived from the nearby Maroon villages, more specifically Abrahamstown, which was minutes away, to finish up the job. In the end, all of the U.S. soldiers lay dead. The African involvement in the massacre was paramount. One observer, Private Ransom Clark, stated that the black Seminoles were, quote, more savage than the Seminoles, close quote.
More than 100 U.S. soldiers that were going from Fort Brooke to Fort King. Fort Brooke near Tampa, all the way to Fort King in Ocala. Let's see if they even mention the blacks, the African self-emancipators, the liberators, the freedom fighters, the true patriots of freedom, justice, and equality. Let's see if they even mention. Bravery and bloodshed. Now let's see if they mention this. Now, like told you before, this would be the location that the massacre actually occurred. We were in Fort King. Fort King is where they were going to from Tampa. This would have been would have been where they would have ambushed them. The Maroons and the Red Seminoles would have ambushed the U.S. soldiers in this specific location here. So now every year they do a reenactment of the Dade Massacre. All right, when Francis Dade, Major Francis Dade of the U.S. military, and his men, he and his men, more than 100 of them, were coming from Tampa all the way to Fort King near Ocala, and they got stopped here by the Maroons, the Africans, and the Red Seminoles, and they ambushed them. Let's see if there's any mention of this. The men who clashed here exhibited great courage on both sides. The bodies of the fallen soldiers remained on the battlefield until General Edmund Gaines, that's where Gainesville is named after, passed here with 1,100 soldiers 54 days after the battle and buried them on site. Soldiers noted 3 Seminole graves nearby, their location lost to history. At the end of the war, in 1842, the soldiers' remains were disinterred here and reburied with honors in St. Augustine, where today 3 coquina pyramids mark their graves, along with other soldiers killed in the Second Seminole War. The war cost about 1,500 soldiers and volunteers killed. Wow. This is a slave revolt, basically, where U.S. soldiers are getting murdered, slaughtered, left and right. But they don't mention black people at all. Not yet. Let's see. Plus an unknown number of Seminole patriots who died, they mention them as patriots, who died fighting for their homes. The unpopular war also cost taxpayers some $40 million. See, this is what I'm talking about, like how people compare it to Vietnam. Most of the Seminoles, more than 3,800, had been shipped west to Indian Territory in modern-day Oklahoma, with only an unaccounted remnant holding out in the Everglades, the ancestors of today's proud Seminole tribe of Florida. Interesting. So is that 40 million from those times? That's a good question. Probably. Maybe not. Let's go over here and see what you So, this is where Major Dade was killed. Francis Major Dade, bringing his troops here. This is the exact point, I guess, where he was slain. Standing on it. It's live, man. The scene of the ambush remained deserted for 7 weeks. So after the ambush happened, the bodies just stayed here for weeks. On February 20th, 1836, an expedition under General Gaines arrived here. So that's what that other marker just said. Yeah. Yep. Over here Captain Fraser fell. Dang, so they actually put these big huge posts up to represent where they fell. And I guess they said they buried them on site. That's what they said Edmund Gaines did. They buried them on site. So I guess this is technically their grave. still no mention of Negro War, no mention of Maroons, no mention of Black Seminoles. They like to minimize the valiant effort of the Africans fighting for their own freedom. Soldiers. Yeah. Still, nothing. No mention of the Africans. This is an Indian war against, from what I see, you would think it's only Native Americans fighting against white U.S. soldiers. So it says, oh yeah, there you go. Black dude. He's been acknowledged. It says, after a century of calling Florida their home, tensions between Seminole people and white settlers were on the rise. By treaty, the Seminoles had been pushed away from the rich coast of Florida onto the internal reservation land. But incursions by white slave hunters and others led to conflict. Okay. Under the 1830 Indian Removal Act, the government had deemed that Seminoles and other native people must leave their homes and move to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Under the 1832 Treaty of Payne's Landing, a delegation of Seminole chiefs agreed to move. But what the government did not, or chose not to comprehend, was that no chief or group of chiefs had the authority to speak for all the people. Their culture did not work that way. Many Seminoles decided to fight for their homes. That fight began here, where you are standing. Wow. The Seminoles of Florida call themselves the unconquered people, descendants of 200 to 300 managed to elude capture by the U.S. Army, Navy, and Marines. Today, more than 2,000 Seminoles live on 6 reservations in the state, located in Hollywood, Big Cypress, Brighton, Immokalee, Fort Pierce, and Tampa. So they have a picture of a black dude, but no mention so much of. They mention slave catchers, but they don't really mention the significance of those 40 on horseback coming from Abraham's town that said, you're not taking our land. You're not taking our freedom. Shoot. Then you got Lieutenant Mudge, the flame here. I mean, even in that time, the primary source records will show you that when people were painting or drawing what occurred here, they drew African people murdering white people, as well as alongside the natives murdering these white people. They depicted it. People talked about it being a Negro and Indian massacre of U.S. soldiers. It was acknowledged back then to a certain degree, even though they really did try to hide it as much as possible in the media. But the truth would come out. Now it seems to be that, this is strictly an Indian war. We don't even talk about the blacks that were involved.
After looking at the signage at the Dade Massacre Historic Park and realizing there is no acknowledgement of the African Revolution in Florida, we have to head back to Fort King to see if their signs mention anything about the African resistance in the state.
Alright, so in this one they actually do mention fugitive slaves, runaway slaves. It says the treaty was intended to ease the conflict and to establish what land would be inhabited by each. It proposed, and they're talking about the Treaty of Moultrie Creek. It proposed that the Seminole must relocate to a 4 million acre reservation located in the middle of the state. Per the treaty, the United States would afford the Seminole protection, husbandry, livestock, and an annual sum of $5,000. The treaty also promised them an agent, interpreter, blacksmith, and a school. In return, the Seminole must relinquish all claims to any other land they had previously occupied in Florida, assist in the capturing and returning of runaway slaves or fugitives, and allow roads to be built for occasional passage by others through the reservation. This is exactly why many didn't sign the treaty, because the red Seminoles and the black Seminoles had become family at this point. Like I said, Osceola was married to a black woman. They had black children. They had a bunch of others they were very much so intertwined in. It was a confederation of villages that worked together in a common defense of the free land known as Florida. They weren't going to just give up the runaway slaves. They fought tooth and nail for this freedom. Over here, the Treaty of Payne's Landing. Now this was the one in 1832 that a lot of those Seminoles disagreed. They didn't want to sign this treaty because they wanted to stay and fight. And since the blacks were their allies, then people like Osceola, people like Chief Micanopy, they all knew if we signed this treaty, we're basically stabbing our black allies in the back. So they agreed not to do that. Yeah. One of the other interesting things here. Well, let's just go over here and check out this this sign. But you'll hear like the black Seminoles, the black people that are involved in these conflicts, you'll hear them referred to as interpreters or slaves of the Indians. Whenever they're going to meet people in Congress and sign treaties and stuff like that, that's how they would refer to them, because they're trying to diminish or belittle the significance that these blacks actually played in these conflicts. So December 28, 1835, let's see, now here's the massacre itself. 2 companies of troops were dispatched from Fort Brooke in Tampa under the leadership of Brevet Major Francis Dade. Their mission was to resupply and reinforce the troops at Fort King. On the morning of December 28, 1835, the troops were ambushed near present-day Bushnell by a group of Seminole under the leadership of Chief Micanopy. Micanopy and his men decimated the soldiers, and only one of the 110 soldiers survived. This event is known as Dade Massacre. See, now what they don't include is that 40 or 50 Africans on horseback came to also reinforce those natives that were engaging in this battle or massacre. And they came in and they started chopping off heads and slaughtering these people as well. And even the art from that time period actually shows that. Images of Negroes and Indians massacring white soldiers. Right? Now, this fort is located not too far from a black neighborhood. And I don't think they want to include too much of that gruesome depiction of blacks killing whites. Might give some people some ideas, if you know what I mean. So, attack on Fort King. The same day as the Dade Massacre, Fort King Indian removal agent General Wiley Thompson was anticipating the arrival of Dade's reinforcements at any time. General Thompson and Lieutenant Constantine Smith were taking their customary afternoon stroll outside of Fort King Palisade, making their way to the Erastus, Rogers cabin a short distance away. During their stroll, 60 Seminole warriors, led by Osceola, orchestrated a brutal attack on Fort King. Shots rang out from the wood line, killing both General Thompson and Constantine Smith outside of the fort. Osceola scalped, like I said, General Thompson, and then he and his men made their way to the Southern cabins. Yeah. So they started burning things down at that point. Still not much mention of this being slave revolt, a Negro war, a black war, even though a lot of the primary sources would say that, would indicate that. Now we got 2 more little signs here, and actually there's some out there, but I already recorded those with my phone. But it was a hard life for the king, Yeah, they're definitely not going to talk about it here. Nothing there. And U.S. Army on the frontier. Alright, so there, this is, I guess this would be, some U.S. Army stuff. Seizing control and taking over, Florida. So what they do every year now is what I learned, I think they just did it in January, is they do a reenactment of the Dade Massacre. So I was looking online and I saw this reenactment, and They have a bunch of people dressed up as Indians and a bunch of people dressed up as white U.S. soldiers. And I saw one black soldier representing the Indian side. Okay, I guess they get a little bit of the history, but it's not encompassing, I think, of really what was going on here. And this was a massive slave rebellion. And the signage doesn't really demonstrate that. This is all Indian war, Indian conflict. And it was, but it was simultaneously was the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history, and arguably a successful slave rebellion, because these people found generations of freedom, not only here in Florida, but eventually after they left here, some of them went to Oklahoma, some of them went to Andros Island in the Bahamas, some of them went to Cuba, some of them went to Mexico, but they continued to find true freedom in the different places that they went, and they weren't willing to succumb to this American dream of freedom and democracy that we purport.
I was curious to know about some of the other Maroon communities in the area that may have contributed to the massacre and the Second Seminole War. So, we decided to check out another Maroon town near Fort King. Three days after the Dade Massacre, on New Year's Eve, 1835, Seminoles engaged in another ambush of a contingent of 750 U.S. soldiers along the Withlacoochee River. Of the roughly 600 Seminoles involved, about 200 of them were black. In 1836, the Seminoles went to take over the Withlacoochee region. Expelling them from the region would be General Edmund Gaines and later Governor Richard Call's objective as leaders representing the U.S. military in the region. With the implications of the African participation in the massacres and ambushes, officials ordered the destruction of the African Maroon communities while they encouraged that the natives take the Africans as slaves. This area, known as Marshall Swamp today, was where one of the former Maroon villages was located that would be burnt down during the Second Seminole War. Here we are at Marshall Swamp. This was also known as Big Swamp. This was the area in which there was a Maroon village that resided in this whole entire swampy area here, and it was right next to Fort King. Fort King, as I explained before, was the location in which we had the Dade Massacre occurred between the route from Fort Brooke all the way to Fort King right here in Ocala, Florida. This Maroon village, it was a village of people of African descent that was associated with the Red Seminoles as well. But this Maroon village was led particularly by an African by the name of Cujo. And this actually means a lot to me because my great-great-grandmother's last name was Kojo, which has its origins from the same place, the Akan people in West Africa. Kojo being an African name for tree-speaking people, the Akan people of the Gold Coast, for people born on Mondays, for boys born on Mondays. And so it's quite fascinating that this Maroon village, or this town, I guess it didn't really retain the name because no one even knows it to be referred to as that. But, you know, reading through Jane Lander's works, Black Societies in Florida, and realizing that these people here kind of referred to this area as Cujo's land or Cujo's village because he was like the leader of this village here. But now, as you can see, it's just a swamp. Just like a lot of the other places in Florida, there's no acknowledgement or recognition to the Maroon villages and the African self-emancipators that actually fought for their freedom here. However, it's still a place where I think people come and can receive pristine natural beauty. Now, trails here, hopefully there's no animals, no bears, no coyotes, but
feeling the energy, I'm feeling the energy of the ancestors. I'm feeling like a true Maroon right now. Almost like that time we got lost in Grenada, in the middle of the rainforest. I'm getting that kind of vibe. So the only difference is Grenada doesn't have any wild animals. Well, it does, but doesn't have any predators like Ocala. We got bears and coyotes and panthers and stuff out here. But we're not going to think about that right now. We're just going to soak it all in. The essence of Cujo. And yeah. So these 40 black warriors that came in to massacre Major Francis Dade on December 28th, 1835, which spearheaded the Second Seminole War. People like Abraham, John Horse, and others were involved in this massacre. I like to call it a bloody battle, because a massacre makes it seem as if, these soldiers weren't predators themselves, and they were harmless and helpless. But no, the only reason why these people were in Florida was to take away the land from the Native Americans and the freedom of the Africans. And they retaliated with a vengeance. They came on horseback. From what I read, they jumped off them horses and they started slice. Shoot, bam, 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 bam. U.S. soldiers just laid dead. Over 100 of them. This was the bloodiest, most costly war that the United States had with natives, even though there were so many Africans involved. So it's really an African and a native war, Second Seminole War. And later on, historians now kind of compare what was going on here in the Second Seminole War to like a war like Vietnam, because a lot of Americans were like, "Yo, what are you guys fighting this war for? He's just losing lives and losing thousands of lives over like 2,000 U.S. soldiers lost their lives. They had 10,000 soldiers deployed here in Florida, and they just kept getting that work from the Africans and their Indian allies. But they kept on insisting that they needed to take over Florida. Same way with the Vietnam War. They kept on insisting that they needed to take over. They wouldn't say take over, but they needed to occupy Vietnam and put in democracy. Same thing that was going on here in Florida. But guerrilla warfare tactics enabled these natives and these Africans to continue to fight to the death. Same as the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong. So there's a lot of parallels, and a lot of American citizens that did not have economic interests in Florida didn't see the value in consistently and persistently sending U.S. soldiers down into this swampy area to get torn to pieces by some runaway Africans. Feeling it now. The U.S. military figured they would continue to attempt to capture the revolutionary Africans to sell them into slavery on U.S. plantations. However, with all of the military training of the African rebels, many disagreed. And Elias Wallen wrote to Congress about the concerns of the black revolutionaries on January 20th, 1836, in response to the news of the Dade Massacre. Quote, "Now just conceive their position, the Seminoles, 800 or 1,000 warriors animated by sentiments of hatred or revenge, and well aware what is to be their fate upon losing their superiority. With them 300 or 400 Negroes of their own, better disciplined and more intelligent than themselves, to whom there is a daily ascension of runaway Negroes from the plantations, supplied with arms and ammunition from the deceased whites." Close quote. This reality compelled the military to take serious action in the area to rid it of hotbeds of revolutionary activity. General Abraham Eustis burned down Abrahamstown in March of 1836 due to its implications of being involved in the Dade Massacre. This action only increased the fight from and alliance between natives and the Africans. The year 1836 was marked with success on the part of the black Seminoles. John Horse, Abraham, and John Caesar made alliances with the newly established sugar and cotton plantations throughout the region. The 1830 census recorded that there were approximately 18,000 whites and 16,000 enslaved blacks in Florida. These numbers don't take into consideration the undocumented Maroons or black Seminoles, with the enslaved black population amounting to almost 50% of the overall documented population, while the enslaved also had the Seminoles and the Maroons on their side. These numbers brought about disconcertment for the slave-holding class. And by the 1830s, Florida had established a very lucrative sugar industry. This profitable sugar industry in Florida was very short-lived due to the Maroons and rebel slaves burning down 21 of the 22 sugar plantations in the Florida Territory. As a result, the sugar industry was never able to recover. Meyer M. Cohen, an officer during the first months of this Maroon War, wrote, quote, "The plantations extending from Cape Florida to Augustine were visited in turn, and nearly all the buildings, including the sugar mills, were destroyed. It is estimated that property to the amount of $200,000 was burnt in 1 week. Nothing was left except the storehouses containing corn and provisions. These were reserved by the Indians for their own consumption. Independently of this destruction of property, the loss to some of the planters was ruinous. In respect to their Negroes, upwards of 300 having been carried off." Close quote. Cohen goes on to mention that Yahahagu and Abraham the Black had been around to all the plantations sometime previous to the commencement of hostilities, and endeavored to seduce them from their allegiance to their owners, with promises of liberty and plunder. After many failed attempts by Governor Call to defeat the Seminoles and capture the Maroons, the Florida general was replaced by General Sidney Thomas Jessup on December 8, 1836. By the end of 1836, it became clear to General Jessup that many throughout the United States had a misunderstanding about the nature of the war. On December 9, 1836, Jessup wrote to the Secretary of War, Benjamin Butler, quote, "This, you may be assured, is a Negro, not an Indian war. And if it be not speedily put down, the South will feel the effects of it on their slave population before the end of the next season." Close quote. Jessup's policy from this point forward was to try to figure out a way to divide and conquer the Red Seminoles and their black Seminole allies. He knew he had to isolate the blacks from the natives. He also knew that he had to locate Osceola, who was proving himself to be a formidable leader, but also an avid ally of the Africans in Florida. As battles ensued in the beginning of 1837, causing losses on both sides, Jessup had new hopes of creating an ally out of the black Seminoles, and his name was Abraham. Jessup realized that if he had any chance of removing the Seminoles from Florida, he may have to directly negotiate with the black Seminoles, because it was the black Seminoles that felt most threatened by removal. By the spring of 1837, Abraham was able to convince notable members of the Seminole Nation to engage in negotiations to move out west. Jessup knew in his negotiations with Abraham that he was not dealing with a simple slave. He was dealing with a leader who had considerable influence over the Seminoles. By March 6th, with Abraham, John Horse, and other black Seminoles present, negotiations were reached. The agreement was entitled The Capitulation of the Seminole Nation of Indians and Their Allies by Jumper, Holatuchi, or Davy, and Yahuluchi, representing the principal chief Micanopy. This agreement was also known simply as Articles of Capitulation. In hopes of appeasing the pro-slavery faction of the U.S. government, Article 5 stated that, quote, "The Seminole and their allies who come in and emigrate west shall be secure in their lives and property, that their Negroes, their bona fide property, shall also accompany them west." Though Jessup knew, as many others were realizing, that the Africans were not the slaves, or as they put it, the bona fide property of these Seminoles, This was included to placate the white settlers and their views on race. Article 5 of the capitulation guaranteed safe passage for the Africans, therefore the Seminoles agreed to assemble for emigration by April 10, 1837. However, when the white Southern planters received word of Article 5 of the Articles of Capitulation, they were enraged. Many of these planters claiming that the more than 700 Africans granted freedom under the treaty belonged to them and their plantations. Simply labeling the Africans as property of Indians did not work as Jessup intended it to. As they pressured Jessup about the freedom and departure of the Africans from Florida, leading up to the April 10th date of assembly and exile, the general rescinded the deal. Not only did Jessup's caving to pressure from the white slave owners compel him to rescind on Article 5, but it also turned him towards issuing Field Order No. 70, which ordered the Seminoles to return all recent runaway slaves who escaped during the Second Seminole War. Field Order 70 caused a wave of slave owners to gather at the military posts throughout Florida in hopes of seizing the blacks assembling there under the Articles of Capitulation and Field Order 70. But Jessup's reneging of the deal caused the black Seminoles to flee and their Indian allies to follow. At that point, Jessup was under the impression that the blacks had a degree of control over the natives because many of the Seminoles' refusal to surrender was based on their black allies not being included in the treaty recognizing their freedom. As a result, by September of 1837, the Seminole War was renewed. General Jessup, riddled with desperation, resorted to deception. In October, Jessup called for a truce. So now we're going to take our trip to St. Augustine. After 1835, when Osceola got out of prison at Fort King, they ended up having this false truce. All right, General Jessup said, look, if you surrender, we'll make sure that everything is good. So Osceola decided, under the conditions of a false truce, he decided to go and meet up with General Jessup. This is when General Jessup imprisoned him, and they took him to Fort Marion, which is also known as Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine, and that's where they held him in prison. This is where we're on our way to now. Let's go check it out. So behind me here is the fortress known as Fort Marion, also known as Castillo de San Marcos. Now this is the location during the Second Seminole War where you had the black Seminoles who were actually winning the war. They came to an agreement, or what they thought was an agreement, with General Jessup, Thomas Jessup. And General Jessup said, you know what, we can have a truce. This was in 1837. The Seminoles all agreed, black Seminoles, red Seminoles, all included, agreed to come to this truce. Well, what ended up happening was it was a false truce on the part of General Jessup. He deceived the Seminoles, and he ended up locking them up and imprisoning them in here, in this prison right here, in this fortress. However, this wasn't the end of the story. Even though there was about 230 Seminoles imprisoned in here, these black Seminoles found a way to get out of prison. They escaped. And to this day, historians aren't exactly sure how these Seminoles were able to escape, but they did. And they were able to continue the fight for their freedom and independence here in the state of Florida. Over 200 Seminoles surrendered and were incarcerated at Fort Marion in 1837, which was formerly known as Castillo de San Marcos. Osceola, Wildcat, and John Horse, among others, were locked up in October of 1837 under the false truce. But by December, 20 of the Florida freedom fighters had managed to break out of imprisonment. However, Osceola died in confinement in South Carolina, while Wildcat and John Horse were among those who escaped. The fighting continued throughout the rest of that year, culminating with the Battle of Lake Okeechobee on Christmas Day, 1837. This battle consisted of 1,000 U.S. soldiers and volunteers fighting on the side of tyranny and 450 Seminole soldiers and their black allies fighting on the side of freedom. Colonel Zachary Taylor, who would later become the 12th President of the United States, led the U.S. soldiers against the African and Native American freedom fighters. After a 2.5-hour battle at the northeast corner of Lake Okeechobee, 26 of Taylor's men lay dead and 112 were wounded. On the other hand, only 4 Seminoles were killed and none were taken prisoner. Despite the outcome of the battle, Colonel Zachary Taylor declared victory and was promoted to general. Though I did not have the opportunity to visit this site in Florida, I checked the state park website and did not see much evidence of blacks fighting for their freedom. Throughout 1836 and 1837, the maroon villages that had not yet been burned down continued to fight for their independence in Florida. The United States military was losing men, and the government was spending a lot of resources and money to defeat these African revolutionaries and their allies. By February of 1838, after accumulating many losses, Jessup decided to alter the goal of the war. He decided to allow the Red Seminoles to stay in Florida for the time being, but put the focus on allowing the Africans to leave. Based on Jessup's personal writings, it could be surmised that he realized that the easiest way to defeat the Seminoles was to rid Florida of their African allies, the group that he believed to be ultimately in control of the natives. General Jessup stated that he was, quote, determined to separate all the Negroes from the Indians and send them out of the country as soon as possible, close quote. In 1838, approximately 500 Africans left Florida for Oklahoma. About 250 of them left under the agreement with the U.S. military. Many of the black freedom fighters settled in Oklahoma until they were compelled to leave to Mexico in fear of being re-enslaved out west. After Abraham spent 1837 and 1838 attempting to negotiate with the United States, he ultimately emigrated out west in the latter year. Not much is known about his life after 1838, but it is believed that he migrated to Mexico with many other black Seminoles at a time when the freedom of the self-emancipators was in jeopardy in the United States. John Horse, on the other hand, made a name for himself as a guide in the U.S. military. After being sent out west, there had been disputes about his status as a free man. He was allowed entry back into Florida in 1839 to assist in the emigration process. He too wound up in Oklahoma and then in Mexico. The descendants of the black Seminole community today in Mexico are known as Mascogos in the town of El Nacimiento in the northern part of the country. In fact, the Maroons of Florida have their own unique diaspora, in which, in addition to their descendants being found in Florida, could be found in Andros Island, Bahamas. The exodus of Africans from Florida to places like Oklahoma, Cuba, or possibly even Haiti would also be an interesting future study. The African American narrative for too long has been one of victimization, helplessness, and defeat. The narrative has always been one of a paternalistic nature, with the white savior liberating the helpless black masses from enslavement because the black masses were supposedly unable to do so for themselves. Not only is this white savior complex prevalent in the African American narrative, but the story of these victims exhibiting a form of Stockholm syndrome and their desire to integrate with the same society that has dehumanized them and brutalized them for hundreds of years is also a predominating narrative. And when the narrative of blacks rebelling is presented, such as with Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, or Nat Turner, it is a story of traitors amongst rebels, defeat, and hopelessness. However, the story of the Africans in Florida paints a completely different story about slavery and emancipation. Their story demonstrates triumph, victory, independence, and woman and manhood. These Africans did not only find short-term freedom for themselves, they found generational freedom that can still be found today in Florida's maroon diaspora. So when Florida freedom is mentioned today in certain circles, let us not forget about the true freedom fighters of Florida who sacrificed their lives in the face of some of the world's worst treatment of human beings in human history? The Florida Maroons, also known as the Black Seminoles, who in fact had waged a successful slave revolt here in the United States of America. The end.
The law. I don't get no but the law. Law don't get no about me. The law. The law. I don't get no but the law. Law don't get no about me. The law. The law. I don't get no about the law. Law don't get no about me. The law. The law. You can catch me moaning, a birdie beating, a rooster yawning. The last rider, shoot 'em up, bang bang from Orange County. My lights are dirty, my eyes tinted and tight on this savage journey. Sipping on moonshine when I'm thirsty, beef jerky to kill my